All right, so this is our first chapter, our first recorded lecture for this class. This is History 201. We're starting with chapter 1, which pertains to Indigenous America. So please follow along as best you can. You can always go back, listen again, follow along with just the regular PowerPoint, whatever you want, but please do make sure you are taking notes as well, so that this will help you better remember the information. So let's get started. All right, our introduction for this chapter. So we often hear Europeans referring to North and South America as the New World. And that's kind of misleading. I mean, it was new to them, and it's a word that's used a lot just because it's easier to say the New World versus North and South America. It's kind of cumbersome. But it's misleading because, of course, millions of Native Americans were already living in North and South America and throughout the Caribbean before European contact was made. Humans have lived in North and South America for over 10,000 years, and they make up dynamic and very diverse groups of people. But the contact with the Europeans that we will be focusing on later on in this chapter will result in this huge global exchange of people, animals, plants, and microbes, which we refer to as the Columbian Exchange. That's going to bring about an end to this 10,000 years of separation that occurred between North and South America and really the rest of the world. It's also going to start centuries of violence, as well as biological terror, which we'll talk about later on, and it will result in a complete revolution in the history of the world. So where do these stories start when we're talking about North and South America? Well, there are various indigenous creation stories, and if you look at any indigenous Native American group, there's going to be some sort of a creation story. So for example, Salinan people of California, modern day California, of course. I'm going to be using some modern day countries to just give you an idea of the area we're talking about. But of course, thousands of years ago, there was no state of California. So again, this is just for reference. They believed that a bald eagle made man out of clay and woman out of a feather. So that's just one example of the many creation stories that are going to be evidenced among different Native American groups. But archaeologists and anthropologists are mainly focused on migration histories. And what we found is that about 20,000 years ago, there was an ice age. And because there was an ice age, the sea levels, which are currently rising due to global warming, were much, much lower. And there was a land bridge across what is now the Bering Straits. There's a map over there to your right, so you can see where the Bering Strait is. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, it is that waterway between Alaska and Russia, and now it's a waterway. Back then, sea levels being lower, it was land, and you could walk right across it, and that's what the ancestors of modern-day Native Americans did. They walked right across it, slowly came down through North and into Central and South America, and that's how they got here. We think this happened somewhere between 12 to 20,000 years ago, and technically, this is the discovery of North and South America by humankind. So agriculture begins in the world somewhere between 9 and 5,000 years ago, and it happens simultaneously at about the same time in the Eastern and the Western Hemisphere. You may have been told, maybe in like a world history class, about the Fertile Crescent and that being where agriculture started. And that's true. That's probably where the earliest example of agriculture did start. But we do have evidence that it did start, again, simultaneously in other parts of the world, independently of one another. So Mesoamericans in Central America focused mainly on corn or maize because that grew the best in that region, and that's going to be the basis of their diet. Agriculture really flourishes in the fertile valleys between the Mississippi River and the Atlantic Ocean. And the Native American groups that live there are often referred to as the Eastern Woodlands Native Americans. And there's lots of different specific groups. That's just an umbrella term. So other smaller specific groups within that umbrella term of Eastern Woodlands, which includes the region in Illinois in which we now live, or if you live in Indiana, that's included too. Here, they grew corn, beans, and squash as their big three crops that they largely subsisted on. So important that they were referred to as the Three Sisters and had a primary role in mythology. And because they were able to have agriculture, they were able to have cities and civilization. This is true the world over. Once you have a stable food source, you can develop cities and civilizations because, of course, if you're living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, it's very difficult for you to do anything other than focus on finding food. If you have a sustainable, stable food source, you're free to go out and pursue other things. Despite this, we believe that agriculture may have initially brought about a decline in health. Also, again, possibly the world over. Although, depending on the region for different reasons, but in terms of the Native Americans, it resulted in weaker bones and teeth. Especially for the teeth, they were unable to grind their corn very finely, and often sand got in there, which would wear away at the teeth, causing decay. But there were, of course, other important benefits. It frees up other people to pursue other skills, become religious leaders, skilled soldiers, artisans, etc. So it's really difficult to talk about all the Native American groups and make like broad generalizations about them, but there are some broad traits that they do share. They share similar spiritual practices, ideas about property, and kinship networks. So again, we're talking in broad generalizations here. Most Native American groups have a combination of the natural and supernatural. They did not neatly distinguish between the two. They felt that spiritual power was tangible and accessible to a person. Additionally, they believed that kinship bound most people together. Communities were typically tied by different kinship networks. And interestingly, ancestry tended to be matrilineal. Family and clan identification came through the female line and not through the male line, as is the case in pretty much all European countries where you trace your ancestry and the emphasis is placed on the father's line, right? Like land would have been passed down from father to son, typically father to elder son in certain communities. And it's different here with Native American groups, and as a result of that, women had greater personal freedoms in most Native American communities. They had a different view of property as well. They did have a sense of personal property. A lot of people think that they didn't, and that's why the Europeans were able to come in and felt it was okay to take the land from them. That's not technically true. They just didn't think that the right to use land implied a permanent possession of that land in a way that a European would think of it. We are going to talk about some groups. Again, we can't, unfortunately, talk about each specific individual tribe. We just don't have time. That would be something that if you're interested in, if you're pursuing history as a degree, you might look at kind of later on when you get into the more specifics. We're just doing broad strokes here. So the Puebloan groups are going to be the largest cultural group that we'll talk about. They were centered in the greater Southwest, and in terms of like what is eventually going to become America, they're going to be some of the first groups to have contact with Europeans as the Spanish settlers push up from Central America. So they're located again in the modern day southwest of America. Because they had very strong agricultural technology, they were able to grow relatively quickly. They had very extensive trading networks with other Native American groups, and they had some domestication of animals, which is not widespread, generally speaking, among Native American groups. Some did. And that's going to be important later on when we talk about the exchange of diseases between the old world and the new world. Most diseases start off with animals, and when you domesticate an animal, meaning you use the animal for your own purposes, so like if you have a dog that's domesticated, cows are domesticated, like they're not wild. You live in close contact with them, and so that virus that starts off in the animals can eventually cross over and make you sick. And because they didn't have a lot of domesticated animals in North and South America, they're not getting sick as often. So that's going to be important to remember later on. But the Puebloan groups did have some limited domestication of animals. Talking about people who lived pretty close to where we are right now. Some Mississippian people of the American Midwest and South create a very impressive civilization known as Cahokia. This is east of modern-day St. Louis. Again, obviously St. Louis didn't exist as a city back then. We're just using it as reference so you can understand where this place is. And it's still there. You can see some of the archaeological remains that are still there to this day, as you can see in the picture on the right. This was a large civilization, a population of between 10 and 30,000 people at its peak. They were politically organized around chiefdoms, and there was a very hierarchical, clan-based system in which they were organized. Social stratification was preserved through warfare. Because of this, they did have war captives that they also enslaved. And slaves were a very important part of their economy. So slavery is going to be something that we're going to talk about throughout this whole course, and in the many different forms in which it existed in what will eventually become the United States. So here's one of the earliest instances, the slavery that existed among some Native American groups. Now this is very different than the slavery that we tend to think of, the really codified slavery of the American South. It was not based on holding people as property, but rather people who were slaves were viewed as people lacking kinship networks. And it was not a permanent thing. You weren't going to be a slave for the rest of your life. You could eventually become incorporated into the tribe, and so thus you wouldn't be a slave any longer. By 1300, the strain that they were experiencing within their economy and their society, which we're going to talk about here in a second, led to Cahokia's collapse. There was mounting warfare amongst competing rival groups. There's also internal political tension, and there was an environmental aspect as well. Local deforestation caused erosion, and an extended drought also made agriculture very difficult to sustain. Without a stable food source, again, you can't really sustain a civilization, and so Cahokia will eventually collapse. So the Eastern Woodlands, these are going to be the Native American groups that are going to come in contact with the English settlers, the early English settlers in Roanoke, Jamestown, the Pilgrims, the Puritans. These are those Native American groups, and again, they're going to be the ones who are in mostly, what is mostly today, Illinois. These are smaller, more dispersed communities. Again, refer to the map over there on the right to see what we're talking about. For example, you have the Delawares, which were located on the East Coast. They farmed present-day New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. And again, these are groups that are loosely bound by political, social, and spiritual connections. They have a very dispersed authority, small settlements, and kin-based organization, but all of this contributed to really their long-lasting stability and their resilience. So these are going to be groups that are around a long time because of that dispersed authority. And really that dispersed authority is going to have an effect on our modern day conception of the United States, where we do have a federal government, but we have somewhat of a dispersed authority as well, in that the states have certain rights that the federal government does not. Tribes of the Pacific Northwest thrived in land that had a pretty moderate climate. They are very dependent on salmon, which of course is plentiful up in that region. And they were valued accordingly. So you can see salmon decorating many items. The salmon was treated with spiritual respect because of their dependence on it. And because they had a very good climate and access to fish from the sea, food surpluses enabled a significant population growth in this region. They built elaborate plank houses. They're pretty well known for that. You can see the picture over there on the right. And they had very varied cultures as well. So again, this is a broad region that we're talking about, and then there's a lot of very specific tribes that, again, for our purposes, we really don't have the time to get into each and every one, unfortunately. Switching gears now to talk about what's going on in Europe. So our knowledge of Native American groups, it is extensive in some ways, but not in others, because there is not the existence of written records that we can really base a lot of our information on. We have to look at other archaeological items. And in Europe, we do have written records, and so that enables us to kind of fill in the blanks better than we might in a culture that does not have those records. So many of you probably know, this is not a surprise to a lot of people, that the Scandinavian seafarers, the Vikings, as they're more likely known as, are going to reach North America technically first. They established limited colonies in Iceland and Greenland, and by 1000 BCE, which is before Common Era, it basically means the same thing as AD. It's just BCE is more politically correct, but whatever you want to use is fine by me. He's going to reach Newfoundland, which is the first contact between the Europeans and North and South America that we are aware of. He does establish a limited colony, but it does eventually fail. Cultural and geographic isolation, as well as hostility by the Native American groups there, eventually drive them back. They just didn't have the technology to keep the supplies coming to this region. So Leif Erikson, he's technically first, technically before Columbus. We also have some emerging evidence that Chinese sailors actually reached the west coast of Central America prior to this as well. Again, it's not really, we don't have any written records, but they probably did. So Columbus, in general, is not technically the first, but he is going to be the first that is going to sustain continued exploration of North and South America. So in that way, it is different. So what is going to drive this exploration? Because people, by this point in time that we're going to be talking about, 1492, of course, is Columbus's famous voyage. They didn't have any concept that the Vikings, this was 400 years ago, they didn't know that they had made this journey. They didn't know North and South America existed. So what's going to drive them to start exploring more? Well, really the Crusades kind of kick it all off. If you don't know what the Crusades are, it is the fight that the Europeans, generally speaking, engaged in to try to win back the Holy Land of modern-day Israel for the Christian kingdoms of Europe, win them back from the Muslim kingdoms that controlled it. It's a whole thing, so if you want to learn more about it, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you're going to have to look into it on your own because we can't get into it. Anyway, that contact, that warfare brought them into contact with different Asian countries and the knowledge that they had and also the goods that they had. And it's going to link them with that power, wealth, and knowledge. And they're going to bring back goods that are, and knowledge and power that are going to spark the Renaissance, fuel further expansion, economically, socially, politically. And it's also going to flood European markets with Asian goods. And there's going to be a huge demand for these goods. Spices, for one, is going to become hugely in demand. Sugar, anything that you can think of that's going to make your food taste good. Silk, which was then pretty much exclusively made in China. So all these luxury items are going to be coming to Europe, and there's going to be this battle for supremacy. Who can control these trade routes and thus control the wealth and the power and the authority that comes from that control? In the meantime, as all this is going on, European nation states start to consolidate under more powerful kings, get more centralized authority. This is going to be especially true in Spain. Spain has a very long history of being divided. It was initially all controlled by the Moors, as they were called. These are Muslims from North Africa. And eventually, slowly over time, European kingdoms are going to push them further and further south until they take control of almost all of the Iberian Peninsula, minus Portugal. So that's this peninsula over here to the right. And this mainly happens under King Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Their marriage brings those two kingdoms together. And together they are going to complete the Reconquista, as it's called. They're going to push the Moors completely out of Spain. At the same time as this is going on, Italian traders are generally speaking going to command the Mediterranean and control the trade with Asia that happens through the Mediterranean Sea. Again, refer to the map to the right here. And so Spain and Portugal here, which of course have a lot of coastline with the Mediterranean Sea, they have to rely on the Italian sailors as their middlemen. And they don't like that because they have to pay higher prices because they have to pay the middleman. And so as they become more powerful and consolidated in their power, they're going to want to seek a more direct route to those Asian markets, meaning go around the Mediterranean Sea. The overland routes are controlled separately by other kingdoms, and then again, the Mediterranean Sea is controlled by these different Italian traders. How are we going to get to Asia not going over land and not going through the Mediterranean Sea? Well, Portugal is really going to be the first one to invest in this kind of exploration, mainly under a prince who has come down to be known through history as Prince Henry the Navigator. He invested a lot personally in research and technology. And blending economic as well as religious motivations, they began establishing these trading forts along the Atlantic coast of Africa. So if you look at this map over there on the right, the blue lines indicate the Portuguese explorers and what they did. And basically, they slowly but surely start going around the west coast of Africa. And eventually they go further and further south. And a famous explorer by the name of Vasco da Gama, using the research and the technology developed by Prince Henry the Navigator, he is able to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, which is the southernmost tip of Africa, into the Indian Ocean, and to access the markets there, the markets in India, the markets in Southeast Asia, and China as well. So that's what the Portuguese are doing. They are also not only exploring the coast of Africa, they are colonizing islands that are off the coast of Africa. And you can see them over there on the map as well. These little islands that are out in the Atlantic Ocean. And what they're doing there is they are growing sugar. As I mentioned before, sugar is a very profitable luxury item that a lot of wealthy individuals in Europe want because it tastes good and you can get pretty addicted to it, as we now know in modern times. However, sugar is very difficult to grow. It needs a very, very specific environment. You can't just grow sugar cane wherever. So for example, in certain parts of modern day Louisiana, you can grow it like in the south, down by New Orleans, and you go a couple miles to the north, can't grow it anymore because the environment has changed. But these islands out here in the Atlantic, like the Canary Islands, for example, have that environment. And they are going to establish these sugar plantations. And initially they use the native labor of those islands, but the labor-intensive farming causes them to die out. So who can they get to man these plantations? Well, they have strong trading contacts with a lot of African kingdoms, and so they are going to turn to slaves from Africa, and they're going to trade guns, iron, various manufactured goods for slaves within those communities. And this really becomes the training ground for the later colonization of the Americas, when basically the same thing is going to happen. Maybe it's not sugar, but they might be growing something else. They might be growing sugar. They might be growing tobacco. But in any case, they're going to turn to slaves from mainly West Africa to work these plantations. So it's first tried out here on these islands in the Atlantic by the Portuguese. All right, so Portugal has found a direct water route to the Asian markets that they don't have to go through a middleman. And again, it's a water route, so they don't have to go over land, which is very expensive and cumbersome. Spain wants in on this too. They see what they're doing, say, this is a good idea. But obviously they can't go around Africa because the Portuguese are already doing that. They control those water routes. So that would just require them to pay another middleman. And that doesn't make any sense. So Christopher Columbus, who is a Genoese sailor, is going to provide them with the opportunity they need to pursue this end. Genoa is in Italy, so Columbus is an Italian sailor, but he is sponsored by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. He did try his idea out on some other monarchs throughout Europe, but they didn't take him up on the offer. They do. Now, I don't know where the whole rumor that Columbus was the first one to know that the earth is round. Sorry if there's any flat earthers out there. I am not going to go along with your idea that the earth is flat. It is round. And educated Asians and Europeans knew that the earth was round by the 15th century when this is all going on. So I don't know where that rumor got started that he's the only one who knows that. It's not true. What he did get wrong, however, is that he felt that it was a whole 2/3 smaller than the Earth actually is. And of course, he didn't know North and South America existed. So in his mind, all you have to do is go west, and eventually you're going to be in the east, right? You're going to be in Asia. He convinces them to fund such an exploration, and on October 12th, 1492, his 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, reached the Bahamas. And you can see each of his voyages on the map over here to the right. Note that he's really only ever in the Caribbean and like Central America. He never actually makes landfall in what is today America, the United States of America. Columbus is going to meet the indigenous Arawak or Taino people found on these islands. He described them as innocents in his diary. We know this because he kept a diary. It's very good information for us as historians. Now, he came to this region for wealth. He thought he was in Asia or India, and that's why the Native Americans have come up with this name of Indians. Why do we call them Indians? They're not from India. This is why. In fact, he went his whole life believing that he had reached Asia or India, not an entirely new world. So he felt like, well, there's going to be all this great wealth. However, he really didn't find any great wealth on these islands in the Caribbean. He did notice, however, that the natives wore these small gold ornaments on their persons. And so he felt like, well, there must be gold somewhere. But when the wealth was slow in coming, the Spanish embarked on this brutal campaign to extract any wealth that they could find from these people. And as a result, the indigenous population will collapse. So, for example, they set up mines to try to mine for gold, and the natives had to find X amount in their weight in gold. And when if they were unable to do this, they would have their hands chopped off. So very, very brutal to try to get this wealth that he had promised his financial backers, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, that he was going to be able to find. Here's a quote from Columbus's diary in regards to, he's writing about the Native Americans here. With 50 men, they can all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them. So this is one of his initial reactions to the native groups. We can see what's on his mind already. But just in case you think nobody objected to this treatment of the Native American groups, it's not true. This is an excerpt from a famous book written by a man by the name of Bartolomé Las Casas. He was a Spanish priest who came to the New World a little bit later on. And he described his outrage at what was going on. He said this: I saw with these eyes of mine the Spaniards, for no other reason, but only to gratify their bloody-mindedness, cut off the hands, noses, and ears of both Indians and Indianesses. So, adding to this mix of violence is the biological aspect of this. So I mentioned before that there are no old world domesticated animals in North and South America. They have very limited domesticated animals at all. And so because of this, Native Americans lacked the European immunological history. They hadn't been exposed to any diseases like smallpox, influenza, measles, typhoid, etc. So this initially was a good thing for them. However, when they come in contact with these diseases, which of course the Europeans bring over, it's just devastating for them. They have no immunity to it whatsoever, and they just die in huge numbers. Disease, warfare, and slavery result in 90%, just think about that for example, 90% of the native population dying out in the first century and a half of European contact. That's huge. And a lot of it, again, is due to the diseases that were brought over. So this is something that unfortunately has been on a lot of our minds, diseases due to the coronavirus pandemic, which is the reason why we're doing this in the setting that we're doing it online. And so we're unfortunately very familiar in how this all works. And if you're more interested in the details of this, the details in, well, how were the Europeans able to pull this off? I mean, obviously, in our modern times, we no longer believe in some sort of like racial superiority. At least I hope most people believe that. How did this happen? Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel is an excellent book that really gets into the details of this and why they didn't have domesticated animals. like the Europeans and the Asians did. Really, really good read. So highly recommend that if you want to look into it. So eventually people realize this isn't Asia and or India. This is clearly a new world, and more people start pouring into the new world, exploring, setting up various enterprises, and basically colonizing this area. So they are looking for a profit. That's why people are initially coming here. And so in order to do that, they are going to manage labor through the encomienda system. This was an exploitative feudal arrangement which would tie indigenous laborers to vast estates to work them. It's very similar to what they did in feudal Europe on the manor, for example. And of course, this is very harsh for the Native American groups. It was abolished in 1542 and replaced with a somewhat milder repartimiento. It really wasn't that much better, though. And so this, of course, is a brutal way of subjugating the Native American groups in order to turn a profit. Now, again, eventually 90% of the native population is going to die out, and yet you still have this economic desire by the Europeans to grow these very labor-intensive crops. Sugar, for instance, tobacco, these are not the kinds of crops at the time that you could simply grow just being, one or two farmers living on a farm. You just can't manage it on your own. They're very labor intensive. And so eventually they're going to start importing slaves from Africa in the same way that they did on those islands in the Atlantic. So as they push further and further into North and South America, the conquistadors are eventually going to contact these massive empires of Central and South America. And the conquistadors are the term given to the Spanish military leaders who are going to conquer these Native American groups. The empires that they're going to contact here really dwarf any other in Native American. These are the big ones. So, for instance, the capital of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan, had 70,000 buildings housing 200,000 to 250,000 people. That's huge at the time. Doesn't sound like a lot now where you have cities with millions of people, but that's big even for European standards. So these are very impressive civilizations. Cortez is going to be the man who defeats the famous Aztec Empire. He does it with the help of a native translator that he referred to as Doña Marina. Using intrigue, brutality, and playing on the political divisions surrounding the Aztec civilization, he is going to defeat the Aztec Empire. He was able to get thousands of native allies, those groups that were subjugated by the Aztecs who had grown, irritated at being subjugated by the Aztecs, are going to join in with Cortez. He eventually is able to peacefully enter their capital. Some believe that they thought maybe he was one of their gods, and so that's why they welcomed him. He captures their Chief Montezuma, and in 1521 start to besiege the city. And part of the reason why he's able to successfully besiege the city and eventually sack it is because many die of the smallpox that he and his fellows bring with him. Further south, there is the very, very wealthy Incan Empire with their capital at Cusco. This is in South America. You can see over there the map to the right. The shaded area shows you the extent of the Incan Empire. And like the Aztec Empire, unrest between the Incas and different groups that they themselves had conquered created a lot of tension. So there were a lot of other groups that were conquered by the Inca who were mad about it and who were willing to team up with the Europeans to try to overthrow that empire. Additionally, smallpox as a disease had spread very quickly and had reached the Incan Empire before the conquistadors even got there. So when Francisco Pizarro, who is the conquistador who enters and defeats the civilization, when he enters the civilization, it's already in turmoil. So it's relatively easy for him and his 168 men to seize the capital in 1533 and have access to, again, the vast wealth in gold that the Incan Empire controlled. The Spanish had several imperial objectives that they wanted to see carried out in what they called New Spain. They wanted to enrich their own treasury back home, convert the natives to Christianity, specifically Catholicism in this case, enhance their prestige back home in Europe, and use the raw materials that they're going to harvest to dominate other European nations. And again, they begin the Columbian exchange, that exchange of plants, animals, and microbes between Europe and the New World. Different with the Spanish, a really big difference between the Spanish and the English settlers, which we're going to talk about in the next chapter, is that the Spanish church and government actually approved of intermarriage between colonists and the natives. And so this is going to create a very unique society eventually in this area where you have this blending of different cultures. So there's going to be a greater tolerance for racial differences than you're going to see the English in North America. Part of that is going to be because, as we'll see, a lot of the early English settlers came as family groups. A lot of most Spanish settlers did not migrate as families. They came as single men, and so they were more likely to marry Native American women. But this kind of intermarriage between the different groups is not really going to exist in the kinds of numbers that you see in Spain. So I put this on here not only because it's maybe Columbus Day when you're watching this, or it has been Columbus Day just a couple days ago, I hope, when you're watching this, but also it leads to our first chapter question. So, history of Columbus Day. Columbus Day became a holiday in 1937. Today it's the second Monday in October. That happened in 1971. It was originally October 12th, the day that Columbus landed in the New World. It's also, fun fact, celebrated in Spain. Columbus himself was not Spanish. He was Italian, as we discussed, but Spain, of course, funded his voyage, and so they celebrated it on October 12th, and it, of course, is designed to honor Columbus's voyage, but also the movement to make this a holiday started in the late 19th century, so that's the late 1800s. It started to be celebrated before it was an official day in cities with large numbers of Italian Americans. We won't get into it in this class, but the other class that I teach does. There was a strong xenophobia at this time against most immigrant groups, but very much so Italian Americans. So, for example, in 1891, there was a lynching of 11 Italian Americans. And so Italian American groups kind of latched onto Columbus, because he just so happened to be Italian too, and wanted to celebrate him as a way of making Americans less hostile to Italian immigrants. And that eventually, again in 1937, turned into Columbus Day. So that leads me to our first chapter question, which is, many cities have changed the name of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Do you agree with this switch? Using historical evidence, which of course we've talked about, explain why or why not. And so you'll respond to that on our discussion board by the end of this week. So that concludes our first lecture. Hopefully you got a lot of good information. Again, you can watch it in bits and pieces, watch it all at once, whatever works for you. Just make sure you watch it by Saturday, when of course you have to finish the quiz and the discussion boards as well.